Hi, and thanks for choosing to watch this in-depth analysis of Munch's Oddysee, the third instalment of the Oddworld series from Oddworld Inhabitants. I think it's clear that this review will make much more sense if you played Munch's Oddysee, as well as the earlier two instalments in the Oddworld series, those being Abe's Oddysee and Abe's Exodus. This review will spoil much of the game and the previous Abe titles, and even if you don't mind spoilers, I recommend playing Munch's Oddysee, as although I try to be as objective as possible, some of my points may inevitably encroach into personal opinion, and you may have a drastically different experience. Munch's Oddysee marks the point where the Oddworld game switched from the 2D cinematic platformers of Abe's Oddysee and Abe's Exodus to being a 3D third-person platformer. This switch up caused a lot of fundamental changes to the way the games were designed, so although this review is part of a series retrospective, directly comparing Munch's Oddysee to the earlier games in the series is relatively tricky, since Munch's Oddysee has much less in common with its two predecessors than they both did between themselves. However, since it is part of the same series and was developed by many of the original dev team with the same creative director Lorne Lanning, Oddworld Inhabitants do try to convert ideas from both Abe's Oddysee and Exodus into Munch's Oddysee, with certain mechanics such as possession and Gamespeak being carried over to the new game with differing levels of success. To get the most from this review, it might be best to watch my earlier reviews of Abe's Oddysee and Abe's Exodus, as I might brush over some of the minor details of the series' main mechanics that I've already gone into when talking about the earlier games. Feel free to check them out either way, but for now let's get stuck in and take a look at the gameplay and story of Munch's Oddysee, how they compare to the earlier Abe titles, and examine Munch's Oddysee as Oddworld Inhabitants' first foray into 3D gaming and all the challenges that brought with it. Munch's Oddysee is the second main installment of the Oddworld quintology. The game introduces us to a new hero of Oddworld called Munch. In classic Oddworld style, Munch is again another charming yet weird looking creature from a beaten down species being harvested for every body part. Munch is a gabbit, an amphibious species which has been hunted to the point of near extinction, with Munch appearing to be the only one of his kind left. While searching for others of his kind, Munch is lured into a trap that replicates the call of other gabbits. Munch later awakes to find himself inside Viker's lab, a floating pharmaceutical research facility that aims to implant Munch with a mind control device to use him as a brainwashed slave that will collect future specimens that are caught in similar traps. On top of this, his lungs will also be eventually harvested and transplanted into the Glucking Queen, so Oddworld Inhabitants spare no time in raising the stakes of why Munch needs to escape, as they have always done in the earlier titles. Munch manages to break his restraints when he overloads his mind control device and turns it into a shocking weapon that he can freely control. Munch also frees a few highly violent furball creatures known as Fuzzles that are being kept as test subjects. He will go on to free many more Fuzzles who will aid him in his Oddysee. A few strides down the road from Viker's lab, we run into Abe again. Abe is living happily with his Mudokon tribe and is still a wanted fugitive by the Gluckins due to his earlier adventures at Rupture Farms and Soulstorm Brew. However, like in Exodus, he is ripped out of his quiet life when he is given a task from a spiritual guide to head to Viker's lab and free Munch, who is also destined to be a saviour of his people from forces unknown. Abe and Munch run into each other whilst Abe is trying to break into Viker's lab and Munch is simultaneously breaking out of it. The two of them then team up to go on an adventure which will have them bringing down Gluckins and Vikers, saving some more enslaved creatures, and finding what remains of Munch's race. In much the same as the previous installments, the pattern of gameplay includes stealth, platforming, puzzle solving, and saving friendly NPCs through Gamespeak, which function as escort missions. Munch's Oddysee also adds in an all-new combat mechanic, which was the most substantial change to the formula since the previous two games mostly asked the player to avoid any confrontation. Because you play as two characters now, each character has a differing set of abilities which players can make use of by switching between characters on the fly, in order to complete the obstacles in each level. Even though Munch's Oddysee manages to bring in a lot of the gameplay mechanics which were present in the earlier two games, the added factor that Munch's Oddysee takes place in a 3D environment changes nearly every aspect of the gameplay. We'll go on to look at the success and failure Oddworld Inhabitants had pulling everything into the third dimension, but for now let's take a look at Munch's Odyssee's greatest change to the gameplay, which was the addition of combat. This wasn't present in the earlier games, so it's the easiest part of Munch's Oddysee to talk about in isolation. As we've seen in the cinematic platformers of Abe's Oddysee and Exodus, the name of the game is very much a version. Players have no direct form of attack in either games aside from rare one-off abilities. Oddysee had abilities like the Spiral attack and grenades, which are both very tightly controlled and could only be attained at specific points in the game. Players could also possess enemies like the Sligs, using their own weapons against each other and exploding them when they ceased possession of them. Possession, like other forms of attack, was tightly controlled by the game through security orbs which would electrocute Abe and stop him from possessing enemies when they were present on the same screen. In Exodus, players were given some more ways to kill, but defense was still a major part of the game. Abe could now possess his farts, which could later be exploded. Abe could also possess more enemies this time, but very few of them died when possession of them was lost, making possession no more aggressive than before. The only direct attack was a new slap move. Abe could slap Sligs while hidden in shadows, slap Madokins, and even hit some parts of the environment. However, slaps were primarily used for puzzles, and would never cause critical damage to enemies, only to Madokin friendlies if you felt like beating them to death. Munch's Oddysee not only allows the characters to physically attack enemies and cause damage to them, but now also allows both protagonists to direct any followers in tow to attack enemies as well. In the case of Abe and Munch's own attacks, Abe is able to hit enemies with a slap attack that now does damage, whilst Munch can drink upgrades in the form of canned drinks to increase the power of his neural implant attack. When not upgraded, this neural implant attack can be used to free trap fuzzles and interact with in-game items. However, when it's upgraded, it sends out a lethal bolt of energy, which lasts for the short time that the upgrade is active. Munch and Abe's combat options also differ when it comes to the followers they lead around. The fuzzles are the most aggressive, dealing consistent but low damage when in large groups. Madokins, on the other hand, deal relatively low damage in their basic form, much like Abe. However, unlike the fuzzles, Madokins come in several classes which are more suited for combat. These upgraded armed Madokin classes include a melee-based Tomahawker who swings a club for additional up-close damage, and a ranged Mud Archer who fires a high-powered plasma crossbow from range. These varying classes of Madokins can either be found in the level itself and asked to join your group, or you can just upgrade regular Madokins at special upgrade stations which are found in certain levels. The new combat mechanics and old Gamespeak mechanics from the earlier games are blended together, once again demonstrating Oddworld Inhabitants' impressive talent to continually find new uses for existing gameplay mechanics. Using in-game commands, NPC followers can be ordered to follow Abe and Munch around the level, be ordered to work, and most importantly, be ordered to engage in combat. There are two types of NPC followers in the game, which can either be commanded by Abe or Munch independently. Munch can control fuzzles, whilst Abe can direct Madokins. Both can be ordered to attack, move and wait, while Madokins can also be ordered to interact with objects such as levers and prayer rings, which will unlock doors and remove obstacles from the player's path. Because of the requirement for Madokins to be upgraded in order to do well in combat, and fuzzles being great at combat from the get-go, each follower type has a clear function to the player. Fuzzles are primarily used in combat situations, whereas Madokins are primarily used for solving puzzles around the level. However, Madokins can become extremely useful in both instances if an upgrade station is available, or if upgraded Madokin warriors are already present in the area. Like every other game in the series, Gamespeak plays a major role, and combat is controlled using Gamespeak voice commands. These commands include a greet command, which can be directed at single followers or entire groups of followers.
How you doing?
Hey, what's happening, Abe?
Hey, you chumps.
Hey.
A wait command to make everyone following you stop in position.
You just hang here for a while.
Whatever.
A fight command to make everyone following you start attacking the nearest enemy.
Jump 'em.
And finally a work command, which can only be used by Abe and makes Madokins interact with objects.
You help me out here?
Oh.
Finally, there is also the ability to make both Abe and Munch fart or belch.
Dude, so that.
Unlike the previous games, which required players to hold a bumper and a face button in order to state a command, all of the commands in Munch's Oddysee have been streamlined, with each command now tied to the face buttons alone. If you push a face button, then you'll give a command, but if the face button is held, then another command will be given. All 6 commands are tied to just 3 face buttons and have been categorized where relevant. All the greeting commands have been tied to a single button, combat and work commands are tied to the same button, and then finally the wait command and the farting ability make up the final button. Giving orders is far simpler in Munch's Oddysee than its prequels. Abe's Oddysee and Abe's Exodus required a player to use a total of 8 unique button combinations in order to give any of the commands, whilst Munch's Oddysee only requires players to use 6 combinations, which is arguably 3 since only 3 buttons are used in total and simply pushed at different intensities. At a glance, it might look like there's less interaction in Munch's Oddysee, as you might notice that the earlier games had 8, not 6 Gamespeak commands. Gamespeak has always seen the most modification between each of the Oddworld games, and while the commands to lead followers around have always been consistent, requiring a greeting, follow and wait command, the remaining commands have been tweaked and replaced between sequels. In the first game, a whistling mechanic was part of the Gamespeak system, allowing players to whistle at certain pitches to pass voice-locked doors, earn special abilities from certain Madokins, and gain the trust of particularly aggressive tribal Madokins in the Munsaic Lines area. There was also the ability to make a whining sound which had no effect on gameplay. In Abe's Exodus, this whistling system was swapped out for numerous other Gamespeak and interaction abilities. Exodus added in a slap ability, the ability to comfort Madokins who all had unique emotional states, and also a work command which has continued into Munch's Oddysee and replaced the superfluous whine command altogether. Munch's Oddysee has once again tweaked the Gamespeak system by removing the ability to comfort Medokins, which is no longer required since Medokins no longer have emotional states. In its place, it has added in the ability to command followers to fight, separated the slap ability from the Gamespeak controls, and continued to leave out the whining command. Also, whenever followers are now greeted, they immediately follow the player, compressing the hello and follow me commands into one single command, which is now a feasible change since you're only ever talking to followers when you're next to them and not halfway across a screen packed with deadly traps like in the previous game, so it's not such an issue for Medokins to walk straight towards you. In terms of actual commands, the number is the same, with useless commands removed or streamlined, aside from the fart and belching sounds which have somehow become a staple of the series. If anything, Munch's Oddysee clears out a lot of the fat when it comes to Gamespeak commands, and while the Gamespeak layout worked for those earlier games, due to the design reasons that I've gone into within their respective reviews, Munch's Oddysee's Gamespeak system is by far the easiest to use and leads to far fewer slip-ups than I'd experienced in the previous games, which can overload players, especially during heated moments. While it could be argued that it's a shame that Oddworld Inhabitants have stripped back on the features like the whistling puzzles and removed the Medokin emotional states, with the latter feature leading to arguably more complex puzzles, Oddworld Inhabitants should at least be praised for their continued been there done that philosophy, which leads them to habitually scrap old ideas that have been taken as far as they can go. Although we'll explore why the combat mechanics in Munch's Oddysee aren't the most fulfilling replacement for the Medokin emotional states, at the very least they are new mechanics that hadn't been in the series up to this point. In another particularly streamlined choice, although neither Abe nor Munch can order each other's followers around, they can order each other around. NPC followers will remain in the same state you left them in when you switch characters. So for instance, players can control Munch to order the Fuzzles to follow him. They can then switch to Abe and get Abe to order the Medokins and Munch to follow him, which means in turn the Fuzzles will also follow Munch. The simple combat and quick Gamespeak controls make moving around with your followers extremely fluid and fast-paced, a playstyle which the Munch's Oddysee developers are clearly trying to capture. When you order your army to follow you, moments like this are incredibly satisfying when everything comes together, and running through a level with a large group of followers drives home the feeling of a revolution taking place, and there's a really great momentum to these moments. The quiet and powerless atmosphere of the previous games is gone, and the new combat-heavy focus and the more aggressive gameplay options make Munch's Oddysee stand out from its predecessors in an instantly striking way. On a grand scale, Munch's Oddysee is a success, but as soon as any level of control or specificity is required from the player, the game quickly becomes frustrating, bordering on broken. When it comes to pathfinding, in any locale other than a large open area, things quickly go awry. It goes without saying that leading followers around was much easier in the Abe series of games, but this is hardly a fair comparison. Those games were 2D platformers that took place on a single plane most of the time. Followers walked in a single block, and although they would blindly walk into obstacles and death traps that Abe himself could avoid, since the player could see these obstacles coming up and knew that Medokins would die if they touched them, then they could easily devise a way around them and maintain control of the situation. The followers in Munch's Oddysee have a full 3D environment to run around in and are sadly just as blind to death traps as their earlier iterations, with the added problem of players also having less control over preventing issues that come about from this. When followers are running behind the player, they will fan out into a group, and because they can all bump into each other and knock each other about, followers will push each other off ledges, run into hazards, and sometimes get caught on the environment and left behind, requiring you to look for them later when you reach the end of the level and find a few followers are missing. In a perfect world, followers would track the player's movements exactly, following in their footsteps and thus avoid any hazards that the player does. However, in a bid to give physicality to Abe and the gang, Oddworld Inhabitants instead allowed the followers to have additional freedom and collision on each other, which quickly deflates any sense of progression and leads to a lot of tedious busywork. Followers will randomly run into mines, fall off deadly ledges, bump into enemies, and sometimes fall off survivable ledges and then be unable to find their way back to Abe or Munch again. This can be an issue by itself if the player is going for a 100% run where they save all the Medokins and Fuzzles using bird portals. But this issue is made even worse since, like the previous games, many levels also require a certain number of followers to survive in order to progress, meaning that the player can lose the game even though they played a level near perfectly and were simply victim to the poor AI and pathfinding.
Who are you?
Hey!
The game comes with a helpful quick save feature, and although this was in Abe's Exodus, it is used far more often here to make up for the game's own mistakes rather than the players this time around. Abe also has a new move to pick up large items, which he can use on explosive barrels and other characters like Medokins and Munch himself. While at first this seems like a neat addition, the move is used very rarely to actually solve puzzles. Instead, a majority of its use is carrying Medokins one at a time through minefields that they can't traverse and backup ledges that they've fallen off. Neat additions like this grab move could have led to interesting puzzles and gameplay, since they give Abe an even greater level of dynamic interaction with the environment, but instead features like the quick save and even the carry move are clearly crutches to fix the issues with the follower pathfinding that the dev team didn't have time to solve. Puzzles are susceptible to the same issues but can't be picked up, which makes them doubly frustrating when they decide to run into a mine or off a ledge. However, given their smaller size and the fact that they actually follow you in single file, they are far less tedious to deal with than the Medokins. Once you've gotten over all that, Oddworld Inhabitants then make the unforgivable decision to allow Abe, the Medokins, Munch and Fuzzles to move at different speeds, so when the player has a large group together and wants to run to their destination, they will frequently have to slow down, do a head count, and then continue on. Tiny little fixes would have solved all these problems, but while these niggles are very small, they add up to making escorting followers and traversing the environment extremely tedious, even though it was one of the highlights of the older games. When problems like these arise, they destroy that revolutionary atmosphere that the developers were going for and make you feel instead like a primary school teacher leading around a bunch of rowdy kids. Because followers now have to fight in order to progress the game, this also causes a big problem when it comes to the karma system. As in earlier titles, players are given a karma rating based on how many Medokins and Fuzzles they save, receiving a range of endings depending on how many they manage to get to bird portals and rescue from captivity. The more creatures you save, the better your karma, and therefore the more fulfilling your ending is. The karma system is a morality system I praised before, as it gives the game a morality system which rewards you based on how much effort you put into playing the game mechanically, and not just an arbitrary morality system which has to be gamed based on its basic rules, rather than taking into account the ethics of the individual player. However, the karma system has been damaged somewhat because it has remained unchanged without taking into account the massively increased chances of having your friendlies die. Unlike in the previous games, where the idea was to guide any Medokins to safety by sneaking and avoiding confrontation, given the presence of required combat in Munch's Oddysee, you now have to put your friendlies in harm's way in order to complete the game. If any of them die, you're reprimanded by having worse karma, which isn't always in your control and forces you to replay sections again that you otherwise played absolutely fine. Some of the Medokins can die, namely the green tribal Medokins, because they are considered already free and not slaves, therefore they have no effect on your final karma result. In fact, many of these Medokins can be revived at special stations in order for it not to be impossible for players to progress if any of them do die. However, that still leaves you with the problem of the enslaved scrub Medokins, which are the boiler suit wearing grey Medokins, and the Fuzzles, who will both remain permanently dead if they get killed, and therefore make it impossible to save them via the bird portals. Every creature in Munch's Oddysee has a set health pool, which is displayed as a number of birds flying over their head. Players can check the health of Abe and Munch, but not the health of other Medokins or Fuzzles. Players can check the health of enemies by possessing them and then checking their stats in the same way they do for the other playable characters. Even with the tedium of possessing each individual enemy to check their health, there is still one important factor missing in order to be strategic in any meaningful way. Different attacks do different amounts of damage, and although it is potentially possible for players to conduct experiments and check which followers and enemies do what amount of damage, it's unlikely to be a reasonable tactic for players to employ, since it takes up a lot of time and controlling your followers in combat lacks any accuracy other than just telling them to start and then stop fighting. Also, health losses are not displayed as numbers, but instead a group of birds flying away from the hurt individual, which is extremely difficult to track on the fly from the visuals alone. The best approach to combat for a majority of situations is to just throw everyone you have available at a single enemy, but even then this isn't always reliable since the followers are relatively dumb and won't necessarily all gang up on the correct enemies, leading to a splintered fighting force and therefore some lost allies. Even if everything goes well, your followers still take permanent damage, which can't be checked on and can't be healed, so even if you get through a battle, you can't be sure which followers to hold back in the next fight if any have taken high damage. You can of course send in ranged fighters over melee fighters in order to take out some enemies from a distance, but since the control you have over your followers is to tell them to follow you and then attack as a group, it can be mind-numbing slowly leading single combatants out of earshot of the rest of the group before you then send them off into battle. Munch's Oddysee now forces you to put your friendlies in harm's way without giving you any of the necessary data to make strategic decisions about whether or not they'll be able to survive the fight, and also lacking any mechanical strategy that you can employ using your inputs. It's primarily a dice roll about whether or not you'll succeed, and although a majority of the fights can be won by sending in high numbers, this is both unfulfilling and will lead to lots of quick saving and loading for those who want the perfect ending. For a game entirely focused on combat, there's very few strategies to employ other than throwing high damage at high defense numbers. If there was a method of switching out members based on their stats or being able to tell individual fighters to flank enemies, then this would be much more acceptable, but it's simply too basic of a fighting system to hold the game up by itself, and it's very possible for you to lose so many followers in a single fight that you'll either be forced to restart the level, or just grind through the remaining forces by slowly fighting them yourself, since as long as either Abe or Munch is alive, the other can be resurrected and continue fighting enemies who remain at the same health. We've already covered Gamespeak and how the mechanic itself comes out of the 3D transfer relatively unscathed, and even improved in some aspects, at least from the perspective of the controller inputs. But there are 3 additional gameplay mechanics that have made their way over from the past games, which include stealth, possession, and platforming. For now, we'll take a look at stealth and possession, which were key to surviving in the Abe titles since they were the primary ways that players would handle their interactions with enemies. These have been copied over to Munch's Oddysee with varying results. The Abe games have an immediate advantage over Munch's Oddysee because each play space was separated into screens since it was a 2D cinematic platformer. While enemies and hazards like floating mines could move between screens, they could only detect Abe if they shared the same screen as him. Because of this, players always knew where the line of sight was, because if they were off the screen, enemies couldn't see them. As soon as they entered the screen and an enemy on the same level turned to face them, then they were visible. Abe was able to sneak and therefore not alert enemies facing away from him to his presence. There were also shadowed areas on certain screens which Abe could stand in to be invisible to enemy sights, as well as ledges which could be hoisted up onto and out of an enemy's view. By sneaking from shadow to shadow, hoisting up ledges and timing movements for when an enemy was facing away, Abe could make his way across the screen and away to safety. Munch's Oddysee's play space is usually within large open environments, which makes it much trickier to judge when enemies are aware of your presence or not. This can be solved by some awkward trial and error to get a feeling for the range at which enemies can see you, but an in-between system would have been a much better fix to this, such as an awareness meter which warned you when enemies were becoming aware of you, effectively breaking up the world with invisible screen boundaries. When it comes to stealth in Munch's Oddysee, it could be argued that players aren't meant to sneak around enemies at all, and the vague enemy line of sight and lack of environmental areas like shadows to hide in might be the best evidence for that. However, Abe can still sneak, leading me to believe that stealth does at least have some function in the game. Enemies can be spotted sleeping, which removes the line of sight issue and allows Abe to sneak through them undetected. Also, like in earlier games, Mudokon followers will also sneak if Abe does, leading to the fact that sneaking and stealth are clearly an option that the developers wanted players to use, and could be used to avoid combat, even with Mudokon followers in tow who are ready for combat. But then the game confusingly doesn't allow Munch or the Fuzzles to sneak, so you will always have to fight enemies if you have either of these characters in tow, and they usually are in tow for a majority of the game. It appears that sneaking and stealth have just been thrown in without any thought to simply create the illusion of options for the player. Aside from a few rare instances, stealth is utterly useless, and add to that the poor pathfinding which leads Mudokons to run into sleeping enemies anyway, it's borderline impossible to use even when it is an available strategy.
Attack!
Whilst stealth and sneaking are poorly implemented, the new possession system overcomes the potential issues that the 3D transfer throws into the works. As with line of sight, in the original Abe games, players were only able to possess enemies which shared the same screen as them. Abe is still the only playable character who can use possession, and since Abe has a hard time getting near enemies without them disrupting his possession ability, as demonstrated by the lack of stealth options, the developers have had to find a middle ground which allowed players to possess distant enemies whilst not making the ability overpowered from being able to do it at long distances. The inclusion of a universal currency known as spruce shrubs is their solution to this problem. Spruce shrubs, which are also known as spoos, have multiple uses within Munch's Oddysee and are a nice callback to the design elegance that I praised Abe's Oddysee and Exodus for. While the previous Abe titles did a lot with very few mechanics, Munch's Oddysee is noticeably flabby. Never in the previous titles would you ever find a mechanic added that couldn't be used in the game, aside from possibly the whine command. But Munch's Oddysee has several additions, most notably sneaking and combat, which are simply underdeveloped or utterly pointless. The creative director Lorne Lanning has been very vocal about the team's issues with crafting Munch's Oddysee, citing a tight schedule, low budget and a lack of experience with 3D games design. In nearly every aspect of the game, these issues are very visible, but Spoos is a rare glimmer into what the developers are capable of. It's certainly not genius games design, but it demonstrates smart problem solving, which in one foul swoop manages to solve multiple problems at once. Spoos can be found scattered along the ground on each level and can be collected as currency, with the number of spoos that each character has collected being visible along with their health. Munch and Abe each have a separate pool of spoos which they can spend on the relevant upgrade stations or the numerous end-level doors which require an amount of spoos to complete the level. The placement of spoos is also a useful way to guide players around the environment, as they make it immediately clear where players can walk and where they can't, which is useful in the numerous levels which have multiple routes. But most importantly, Abe can also spend spooks whenever he goes to possess something. Whenever players begin a possession, Abe will create a possession ball in front of him. The longer he possesses for, the more spoofs will be spent on the ball, up to a total of 10 spoofs. And the bigger the ball gets, the further away it can travel from Abe. In effect, this allows Abe to possess enemies in a 3D environment within a certain range while staying out of an enemy's line of sight. The possession ball can then be controlled by the player, jumping and floating its way to the desired target. The downside is that if players want to keep possessing, they'll have to collect more fresh spoofs or grow them again. Having to collect spoofs is a great way to force players to explore the level, and growing more spoofs is an elegant way to both allow players to never run out of currency, and therefore trap themselves in the game, but also punishes unskilled players with having to collect more spoofs at a slower rate if they run low. Players can possess every single enemy in the game, with Vikers, Sligs and Slogs being the only enemies that will die when they are unpossessed, making it impossible to kill every enemy through the cheap means of possessing from a distance, retaining some of the difficulty from the earlier games. Like in the previous games, enemies can still be protected from possession by floating security orbs. Security orbs can be a little more tedious this time, as they're pretty small and they don't have a design anywhere near as striking as in the earlier titles. Also, the previous line of sight problem makes it pretty tricky to work out where your possession will cut off. Like in previous games, possessed enemies can use all the same abilities that Abe can when it comes to upgrading themselves using upgrade stations, attacking other creatures, and communicating with their own species. Although it should be noted that when it comes to enemy Gamespeak, it now only includes the ability for possessed creatures to make noises or insult each other, without having any gameplay value like in the previous games where you could order other creatures around, a feature which is sad to see missing in this installment. But overall, the controls from the main characters transfer pretty perfectly over to the enemy controls, as they always have. Possession also has a time limit now, so players have to use possessed enemies quickly or else they will lose control of them without also killing them. The new possession system retains nearly all the strengths it can after the addition of a third dimension into the mix, while adding in some extra challenges for players. Of all the gameplay transplants, possession is easily the biggest success between Munch's Oddysee and the older titles. The praise that can be given to Munch's Oddysee in retaining the strengths of its predecessors is sadly fleeting and is especially problematic when it comes to enemy design. Enemy types have been drastically cut from the previous game's rosters, with the main enemies now only featuring Sligs, Slogs, Vikers, Paramites, Scrabs, and Gluckins. Paramites and Scrabs only appear briefly from one level each, and Gluckins are only possessed to push a single button at the end of many of the levels, unable to leave the single room which they are trapped in, whereas they were fully controllable and required the use of Gamespeak to command Sligs around in earlier titles for meaty chunks of game time. For the majority of the game, the only enemies on offer are Sligs, Slogs, and Vikers, with Vikers mostly appearing at the tail end of the game. One of the strengths of the earlier games was how each enemy type had a completely unique behaviour that forced the player to have to change their entire playstyle to best them. Scrabs and Paramites weren't simply extra enemy skins to make the locales feel different. Instead, Scrabs and Paramites came attached with a whole social aspect, where Scrabs in groups would become hostile to other Scrabs in the area and ignore Abe, whereas Paramites would vice versa become hostile to Abe when in groups, but were friendly to Abe when alone. It was this social aspect which gave the levels these creatures were placed in a fresh challenge. The aim of beating Scrabs and Paramites was no longer to just run past them or kill them outright as you would with Sligs and Slogs, but to play the level in a way that would force you to bring enemies together into one area, in the case of Scrabs, or direct them away from one another, in the case of Paramites. Although these tactics were slightly trodden on by the ability to actually possess Scrabs and Paramites in Abe's Exodus, the presence of security orbs and temples still force you to play this way, with the added addition and fun of being able to actually play as a Scrab and a Paramite this time around. There were subtle environmental puzzles at play here, where you would have to plan how you made your way around the level in order to take out these otherwise invincible enemies. On top of that, they were incredibly terrifying to run away from if they ever became hostile and started to pursue you. Whenever Scrabs or Paramites were around, they created tense and often frantic emotions within the player. Without these unique social behaviours, Scrabs, Paramites and every other enemy type would simply follow a pattern of see, hunt, kill, a routine which the Abe titles managed to avoid even with their limited resources. Some enemies couldn't be possessed, some enemies wouldn't die when leaving possession, some enemies would chase you down, some would have ranged attacks, some would be able to follow you up to higher platforms, whereas others would lose sight of you if you hoisted up and away. Every enemy had unique AI which immersed you further into the world and mixed up your playstyle. However, this aspect of the game is entirely missing, with the clearest of these cutbacks being with the Scrabs and Paramites, who used to have diverse behaviours but are now both found in massive herds, waiting to chase you for one single sequence. Neither the Scrab nor Paramite sequences differ from one another at all, and it may as well be the same level over again. On a side note, there is also a distinct lack of care for the world building, given that scrabs which will kill each other on sight now just sit happily together in a pen, which is something that has been well established by this point. Of course, expecting scrabs and paramites to have the same impact as they did in the Abe titles is slightly absurd. The tension of those games and their enemy encounters came with the fact that every enemy was a one-hit kill, and when escaping, Abe's movements had to be timed very carefully. Every movement you made had weight, and every mistake had consequences, something which is obviously missing in the health-based system which Munch's Oddysee uses to make its overall combat system workable. This tightness and accuracy of control from the earlier titles has been lost now that Abe and Munch control like standard third-person characters, with analog controls and a single jump button. In the 3D environment of the new games, there's a lot more leniency in your movements since you have a large environment to run around in and can therefore be more casual in your control over the characters. The profile system that was found in Abe's Oddysee and Abe's Exodus is gone, and Abe now only has one standard jump, which removes the choice of long jump, bunny hop and hoist movements that the player would have to choose between in the earlier titles. Platforming is now just a case of running towards a gap and pressing the jump button at the correct time, which lessens a lot of the timing and decision making which was required to make Abe clear gaps and obstacles in the old games. These older titles saw players having to select which jump out of a selection of jumps would be appropriate for the section, and allow the player to move through the tightly designed grid system, which would see Abe die instantly if he made even a single step out of place. Adding insult to injury, as well as the fact that Abe's movement is far less complex than before, the team have somehow managed to give Abe possibly one of the worst jump cycles in history, making his jump way too quick and vertical to be viable for satisfying platforming, but also making him do a forward roll in the air, removing all the weight that the character used to have and instead making him move more like Sonic. Oddworld Inhabitants have done very little to make up for these sweeping cutbacks when it comes to the game's complexity, and by finally chipping away enemy AI to the point where the only difference between enemies is that those with guns will attack you from range, and enemies with melee will run up to you, the decisions players have to make in terms of dealing with enemies is to just run in the opposite direction or send in your own followers to kill them. Instead of species diversity and a focus on creature behaviours, Munch's Oddysee is now a fighting game. Unlike the way players can upgrade their own NPC followers into different classes, Munch's Oddysee takes its small roster of enemy types and splits each one up into several classes also, with each class differing based on their weapons, total health, and the amount of damage they deal. Of the remaining Slog, Slig and Viker enemy types, Slogs come in an adult and baby form, with the adult dealing the most damage of the two. Sligs come in the most forms with a total of 4. There's the Slacker, who is a standard Slig who only carries a baton as his main weapon. The Bouncer, who has better armor and therefore higher health than the Slacker, but with the same baton melee weapon. Thirdly, there's the Popper, which carries an assault weapon and can have either body armor or none at all. Lastly, there's the Big Bro Slig, who is a huge steroid pump tank. He carries around a minigun which does the highest damage of any weapon and also has the highest health. However, unlike the other Sligs, his movement speed is slowed drastically due to his size. Vikers come in a similar variety to Sligs. There's a Viker who fights with just fists, a melee Viker who wields butcher knives, and armed Vikers who carry machine guns. Many of these different types of Vikers can come with or without body armor, giving you about 5 Vikers in total, with each Viker having a higher damage output and more health depending on their weapon and if they have body armor or not. Unlike the Sligs, there is no size or movement variations amongst the Vikers, who only differ based on their weapon type and armor. Although Munch's Oddysee technically has a higher number of enemy types overall compared to the old titles, the way they affect gameplay is greatly restricted. And all of this would be much more interesting if Munch's Oddysee had combat mechanics which force you to tackle enemies in unique ways, such as having to ambush them, use certain weapon types to tackle armoured enemies, or even directing your followers in a way that allows you to create formations to best tackle certain enemy classes. But because both the variety of enemies you face and player choices in combat are so stripped down, all you'll ever need to do is run away, attack in the largest numbers possible, or if that isn't an option, just slowly possess and kill every single enemy. The latter option is especially nasty when you can only possess low-powered enemies, since as soon as you start attacking another enemy, they can immediately begin attacking you back. Aside from guns, attacks don't stagger enemies in Munch's Oddysee, so as long as you're attacking a creature, they can continue to attack you too. This usually means that you can kill an enemy just before they kill you if you land the first hit, but it makes it nearly impossible to kill 2 enemies in one run. Although this was a minor problem in the earlier games when you possessed a Slig around other Sligs and they would shoot you immediately, for the most part you could always get the drop on an unsuspecting enemy and take them out first. Something which just isn't possible with Munch's Odyssee's combat, leading to lots of tedious back and forth if you get yourself locked in a corner. In my earlier rundown of comedy in the Oddworld series, I've talked about my issues with Munch's Odyssee's huge tonal shift from the previous 2 games, and how a slow increase in fourth wall-breaking visual gags and broad comedy began to cheapen the relatively cold and dark atmosphere that the earlier games established. Although I haven't changed my mind on this, I like to think that these videos have gotten better over time, so I'll take a moment to sum up my points more concisely and also then go into other aspects of Munch's Oddysee story and its pacing, which affect both the gameplay and narrative alike. Comedy in the Oddworld series isn't the issue. Although Abe's Oddysee was a morbid game, it certainly had its moments of lightheartedness, and I would never say that every subsequent follow-up game had to match its style. After all, the Oddworld games are hoping to explore the ecosystem and politics of an entire planet, and I would never claim that within that expansive world there mustn't be moments of darkness, tragedy, victory, and light-hearted moments, a variety of tones which can be found among all walks of life. Abe's Oddysee notably has fart jokes, comic overblown violence, and satirical character design, and lots of physical comedy from Abe himself. However, there is a distinct difference between comedy which emerges from a situation itself and comedy which is derived from self-referencing and making the audience part of the joke also. Abe's general lack of coordination and stumbling his way through to success is all part of Abe's character, and while it's ridiculous that everything works out for him, Abe is simply an unlikely hero and his actions are all possible and consistent in the world he inhabits. There is one very specific moment where Abe falls down a cliff in Abe's Oddysee and actually ends up dying, but he is brought back to life by a nearby spiritual guide called Bigface, who believes Abe is a Mudokon prophet and has a destiny to fulfill. Although this is completely unrealistic in our world, the world of Oddworld is established to contain some kind of magic or spiritual energy, so while there are real-life consequences to mistakes, like falling to your death, there are also supernatural fixes to these problems. Never at any moment is your immersion broken, since you always believe that Abe and others around him are acting in a way that is natural to their world and culture. Even when it comes to the extreme antagonists of the world, with the Sligs being brain-dead assholes and Gluckins being clearly overblown portrayals of heartless businessmen, at no point do you not believe that these creatures could be real, given that their world thrives off destructive corporatism and widespread slavery. Every over-the-top awful person in the world makes sense, given how over-the-top and awful their society is as a whole. Abe's Exodus went on to add even more layers to the world, introducing a whole new range of characters and aspects to Oddworld society, and Munch's Oddysee takes this to another level. We discover that Gluckins have an absurd hierarchy purely based on wealth, where the more money a Gluckin has, the more gaudy they become. We learn that Gluckins have a queen, as do the Mudokons, with the Mudokon queen being held captive somewhere and forced to lay eggs which supply the Mudokon slave labour force to Gluckin-controlled factories throughout Oddworld. We are also introduced to the incredibly childish and whiny Vikers, yet another dominating species in Oddworld who are teased in Abe's Exodus. For a game series that is supposed to be getting bigger in scope, increasing the world of Oddworld is fantastic stuff, but the presentation is all off this time around. There's no bite to it anymore, and there's no horror or disgust to the world. Where once we saw Mudokons being worked to death as a miserable existence, now everyone is light-hearted. The scrubs you save are extremely laid back when you save them from the horrors of the factory, as if nothing up to that point had really bothered them.
Okay, listen up. Hey.
On our last Exodus with a group of freed Mudokons, they would argue with Abe, questioning his judgment, but overall be concerned with saving their race. Now everyone seems like a backstabber whose actions are purely dictated by how wacky and entertaining they can be. Mudokon followers now push Abe into a potentially deadly well, and run away when he needs their help, complete with a comedy sound effect of course.
Go before it's too late. Okay, here goes. Whoa, that's too high for me.
In Exodus, the Mudokons who didn't listen to Abe and drank the bad Soulstorm brew were out of action for half the game, and Abe had to find a way to save them. Now when Mudokons don't listen to Abe, they just comically sprint away like they're in a cartoon, even when they leave their leader for dead. On a related note, during this sequence where Abe and Munch fall from Viker's lab, they fall much further than Abe ever did during his fatal fall in Abe's Oddysee, yet now they just brush themselves off, because Oddworld is now a cartoon. Other aspects of the world, such as the Mudokon Queen, are completely glossed over, even though the reality of her existence is absolutely horrific, a horror that the series hasn't been scared or incapable of tackling in the past. I'm very personally of the opinion that a series should adhere to strict rules that it establishes, whether those rules are pertaining to how the world works or the tone it is presented to us. As soon as you begin to break rules and not care for how you present your world, then anything can happen, and then the reality of that world is shattered. Different series can have their own rules and tones and approach any subject however they want, but I don't think it's good to randomly start changing how you approach topics and events within the same series, as the points and story beats you're trying to establish become hazy. In one game, slavery is treated with horror, yet in its sequel it's now just a bit of a laugh. I also don't know whether to be scared for a character now that is falling from a great height, or be completely indifferent. What I do know is that if the series tries to emotionally engage me later down the line by having a character fall to their death, I will have flashbacks to Munch's Oddysee and be completely numb to their attempts, since they sacrificed any future tension they could build up with a cheap one-off gag that wasn't even funny. While the first two Abe games had Abe struggling to survive and dying at any moment in a hostile and incredibly cruel environment, now we have silly characters who are loyal or treacherous based on which is funnier or more plot convenient. We have funny little pieces of music and sound effects to highlight gags which would be more fitting in a cartoon.
So we wait here and gather up all the egg crates that Abe and Munch are gonna throw into the loading chutes. Right?
That's my understanding.
I hope they don't break them all.
And then we have numerous moments where characters look dead into the camera and talk to the audience.
You will succeed. Help Lulu. And then...
That's it? That's the big message?
I'm not in Oddworld, so I shouldn't be talked to, and the older games had no problem ignoring me either. Munch's Oddysee starts dramatically, in a way that is more in line with the older games, as it establishes Munch's misery in discovering he is the only Gabbit left on Oddworld. But after this, it quickly becomes far more light-hearted as it introduces the Fuzzles, antagonists, and later Abe. The game is setting up a buddy comedy, but starring two very odd and relatively clueless aliens. The more pumped-up soundtrack and action-orientated aggressive gameplay sell this atmosphere from the get-go, and it tonally establishes itself as a comedy, and the buddy aspect is a great concept for this world, and a good direction for this game to take in order to separate itself from the older titles. But the cartoony effects, fourth wall breaks, and a complete aversion to exploring any of the horror of Oddworld make the game completely unengaging, and as we've seen from the previous titles, it's not as if you can't have a mix of both serious and funny moments. Instead, Oddworld Inhabitants are fighting to keep this game as light as possible, to the detriment of its message, which is supposed to be a satire and exploration of corporatism and environmental destruction run amok. They either can't be bothered to make the two tones work, are incapable of doing so, or much worse in my opinion, are aware that they're ignoring the world they've drawn their audience in with, and are just ignoring it because they want to make a completely ill-fitting and funnier game without the risk of creating a new IP. The evidence seems to point to the latter, since Lorne Lanning has stated in a few of the rare interviews he gives that the increased amount of comedy in Munch's Oddysee was a regret of his, and this is very evident in the 180 in tone that the sequel Stranger's Wrath pulls, suggesting that he just felt like making a funnier game without thinking about how it would affect the overall series. The upcoming Soulstorm game, a spiritual remake of Abe's Exodus, also appears to be going for a more horrific and serious tone as well. It's difficult to assess if Munch's Oddysee was originally supposed to be this light-hearted. The darker elements of the game, such as Munch's lungs being transplanted into the dying Gluckin Queen and the imprisonment of the Madockin Queen, are only hinted at in brief bits of dialogue and newspaper clippings which punctuate the end of each mission. Munch's Oddysee was Oddworld Inhabitants' first 3D game and was beset with numerous well-documented development problems which saw the removal of several key plotlines, including meeting the Madockin Queen and also the trial of Mullock the Gluckin from Abe's Oddysee. As time and money disappeared, the developers had to cut more and more, which is why the scope of the narrative feels much smaller and why there are so many seemingly underdeveloped features and bugs in the gameplay. While the cuts to the game don't obviously hinder the story or cutscenes, since the CG is as high quality as it's ever been and there is a complete narrative here, they do obviously encroach onto the gameplay. Unlike the last games, where the intent was to escape a single huge facility, a majority of Munch's Oddysee story sees you breaking into lots of smaller Gluckin businesses, shutting each one down as you go. Munch and Abe are free from the start of the game, so instead of breaking out of facilities, they're breaking into them instead. A majority of the story revolves around Munch and Abe possessing numerous rich Gluckins and forcing them to donate to Lulu's fund, an Oddworld equivalent to Kickstarter, which a lazy homeless Gluckin called Lulu has set up out of desperation. Whilst no Gluckin respects that, Abe's possession forces them to give up all their funds to make Lulu the richest Gluckin in the world, with the final objective being to possess Lulu and purchase the final can of Gabbit eggs, known as Gabbyar, at an auction and save what remains of Munch's species. Rather than being the vulnerable rat trying to escape a labyrinth, here Abe, Munch and co are on the offensive, breaking into a new facility each level, bringing it down and then leaving. It's a fun outlaw adventure. While this sounds fun as a setup, sadly the story never develops much further than this, and most of your time is spent appearing at a random business and then being informed afterwards by a spiritual guide about why you're there, rather than seeing Abe and Munch actually come to the decision to go there themselves.
Oh, okay. Now it gets a little rough. These tribal lands have been invaded by Slig security forces. Only one lone Mudokkin fortress still resists. Help the Mudokkins to expel the Sligs, then get your butt over to the Slog Hut.
Oh, yeah.
Hey.
Aside from the odd one-liner and a handful of cutscenes, we also never really see Abe and Munch interact, so we never really get a good sense of where their friendship is going. In fact, for this reason, Munch's Oddysee suffers from the same feeling of directionlessness that Abe's Exodus suffers from also. I've said before that while Abe's Oddysee has a very simple story, which follows the arc of Abe running away from Rupture Farms, learning he is a Mudokkin prophet who must save his people, and then returning to Rupture Farms to save the Mudokkins enslaved within and blow up the facility, that this simplicity at least carries some weight with it that you were overturning a force greater than yourself, and this uphill struggle always gave Abe a purpose for moving forward and for the player to root for him. Abe always had a clear objective that he himself was moving towards, and the gameplay and challenges you faced reflected this. As you went deeper into the bowels of Oddworld and escaped into new environments, the gameplay changed with those new settings, and you constantly felt that you were adapting to meet the new challenges and didn't know what was ahead, much like Abe, who had spent his entire life locked up in Rupture Farms. While Abe's Exodus also involves Abe being trapped in a large facility, which he has to bring down, in fact there are 5 main facilities this time, it began to fall down a slippery slope by having Abe randomly turn up at areas which would turn out to be plot crucial without his knowing, creating the effect that it didn't feel like Abe was controlling his own actions, and therefore no adventure of discovery was taking place. Instead, the player is just vaguely told to blow the place up from the get-go, and then the game continues as an endless series of levels with new puzzle mechanics for you to overcome, and hopefully be entertained by until the game finishes. Munch's Oddysee strikes a strange balance between the two. On the one hand, Munch's Oddysee has a simple story which lays itself clearly out from the start. You have to supply Lulu's fund in order to eventually buy the Gabiar, and you'll have to shut down several companies in order to do it. However, every single level of Munch's Oddysee revolves around turning up at a company, saving the people trapped in there, and then possessing the Gluckin owner. And there is no break in this cycle until you head to Viker's lab to steal the Gabiar in the final few levels of the game. The plot here requires more setup than the previous game since it has new characters to introduce and also needs to fill us in about how Gluckin culture works in order for the Lulu fund story to make any sense. In classic Oddworld Inhabitants style, they once again have an art for keeping cutscenes brief and spread out evenly throughout the game. So even though more world building is going on than ever before, you never feel like control is being taken away from you for long. But once the setup is established, it still falls back into the same level of repetition that Exodus does, as you are given an objective and then just repeat a lot of levels in between with no real sign of an ending. And this continues until the creators have just designed enough levels to fill out the playtime, and then it's time to just go to Viker's lab and clean house. However, Munch's Oddysee is still much weaker than Exodus because while Exodus made up for its lack of direction by throwing new puzzle and action challenges at the player pretty much constantly throughout, Munch's Oddysee has far too few mechanics and bare-bones ideas to keep the player engaged for that long. As we've established by this point, playing the Abe-based Oddworld games generally force the player to use stealth, time platforming, dealing with varied enemy interaction, and using Gamespeak. All of these factors are blended together to create ever-changing gameplay which shifts from action-orientated set-piece, accurate platforming sections, stealth sections, and solving puzzles. All of these sound a lot like what Munch's Oddysee has to offer. After all, there's enemy interaction in the form of combat, Gamespeak with followers, platforming, and even some puzzles thrown in. However, what made the Abe titles different to Munch's Oddysee is that while the Abe titles had similarly simplistic gameplay to Munch's Oddysee, all of the elements of the levels were blended together so that the player was always problem solving, even if they didn't realise it. A level of engagement which Munch's Oddysee sorely lacks. Here's a general example of what playing a level in the earlier titles was like, so we can see what Munch's Oddysee is missing in comparison, even though it shares some of the key elements. In Abe's Exodus, every obstacle you faced was a distinct challenge which took thought and planning to get around. Even something as simple as a jump had to be timed carefully, and the levels were designed to cater to Abe's movement, which was based on a grid system. As long as your timing and understanding of Abe's movement was there, you could make your way around levels, but every one of your movements had to be clean, and there was very little room for error, so even moving around kept you engaged and was a test of your skills. Enemies were also a major threat because of the amount of damage they could do, and because of the wide variety of enemies, each one had to be tackled in a unique way. Abe couldn't just go head-to-head with enemies. If it was a slig, he would have to get on top of them in order to possess them, or if there was also a security orb present, he would have to sneak around the enemy or find a way to destroy the security orb, or even possibly distract the enemy away from the security orb. If he did manage to possess the enemy, then possessed enemies would give the player an opportunity to explore the level and see what obstacles lay ahead, and maybe kill some enemies along the way. Alternatively, a player might come face to face with slogs, which they would then have to run away from and get onto a nearby ledge. Even worse, if they ran into fleeches, then Abe couldn't even rely on the safety of higher up platforms, removing that strategy from the player entirely. And finally, as we've already discussed, Scrabs and Paramites required an element of planning to abuse their social features. Combat wasn't just about killing what was in front of you, it was about tackling each unique enemy behaviour, turning combat into a problem-solving exercise. On top of that, followers would also play a part in the level, so aside from just sneaking around and dispatching enemies yourself, you would also have followers in tow who were even more vulnerable than you, adding to the issues you had to solve. And the Mudokons in Exodus were also subject to emotional states, so none of them responded the same way, and even getting past friendly NPCs became a challenge in itself in that game. These large-scale issues would cover entire levels, and without realising it, you were unfolding a massive level-wide puzzle box the more you explored. One lever could activate a well several screens away that you would have to discover by exploring the level, and a rolling rock which you escaped from could do something like block up a bee's nest on the other side of the level, which was restricting you previously. You were playing a puzzle game without realising it, because the level design was so intricate and your movement and abilities were so precise and intertwined, everything you did had consequences if it wasn't thought out beforehand. By stripping away the multi-layered levels and movement mechanics of the original game, Munch's Oddysee makes exploring the levels easy and brainless. And in the process of focusing on combat and simplifying the enemy types, it also lays waste to the enemy aversion and stealth gameplay which made the older game titles so tense and taxing. Dispatching enemies in Munch's Oddysee is no longer a cognitive problem. You simply possess and kill everything from around the corner without even having to get close to enemies, or simply bring together lots of followers and attack. Each enemy is approached in the same way, with few behavioural differences between enemies, and therefore no problem solving. Your followers are also able to defend themselves and have generous health, so very little thought has to go into protecting them, aside from when you're forced to carry them through a minefield or back up a hill, because the game hasn't been designed for leading escorts around and instead has crutches for you to break the game and just carry your followers through any challenges that now just feel like busy work. Every facet that made the earlier Abe titles memorable has been stripped down or removed completely, without thinking about how it affected the delicate and intricate formula that the thrill of the older games thrived on. Having said that, Munch's Oddysee does sometimes go out of its way to vary your playtime with larger set-piece moments, and during these the game has improved dramatically. I'd say that although most of the systems in Munch's Oddysee have been undeveloped, the movement of Abe and Munch is still very satisfying. It's made much more satisfying in the recent HD release, which lessened Munch's annoying bouncing noise whenever he moved, gave Abe a separate run button instead of tying it to how far you push the thumbstick, and finally moved Abe's attack ability away from the thumbstick as well, which was a bizarre choice of button to begin with for something that's pressed so often. The standout moments include mech fights where Munch takes control of a robot and fights his way through an area. Munch's swimming levels are also great, where the solid ground is littered with enemies that Munch can't fight, but he has to make his way across these areas in order to reach new areas of water and progress. This leads to a satisfying blend of the acrobatic and smooth movement that Munch enjoys in the water, followed by a tense escape sequence as Munch makes his way across the ground, and players have to scout the area to work out how they're going to get to the next body of water safely. There are also big gauntlet areas where players are forced to move through an environment packed with enemies, and the player must use power-ups in order to speed their way through and help Mudokon scrubs along the way. The repetition of these areas can get annoying since players may have to go back for multiple scrubs during the running sequences since they can't follow the player. But it's one of the few times that Abe and Munch are really able to move and the player's reflexes and ability to plan ahead are tested. Some of the best parts are where the action really gets going, and large-scale shootouts where the player uses Munch or Abe to take over a mech or a big bro slig are also incredibly enjoyable. The player is able to briefly enjoy a nice stretch of bombastic combat, and it's very cathartic to take on the enemy in such a personal and vicious way, given that you're so underpowered most of the time. It's a great shame that most of the combat gameplay involves using Abe or Munch directing armies around on the ground, and therefore having to deal with a combat that doesn't really involve them and is incredibly simplistic. The power-ups in the game are another fun addition, and something which the series has always played around with. Abe's Oddysee offered prayer rings that allowed you to destroy explosive items on screen, while Exodus added in the ability to become invisible, cure sick Mudokons, or get explosive farts from vending machines. Munch's Oddysee does much the same, but greatly expands on the power-ups available and adds in the ability to stack power-ups. Instead of just having a super speed power-up or high jump power-up, Munch's Oddysee lets you have both. The amount of stacking can become ridiculous with the player able to gain as many additional powers as are available. Power-ups allow players to enjoy faster-paced chase sequences, more aggressive combat, and even stealth sections at points thanks to the appearance of an invisibility power-up which makes Abe or Munch undetectable to enemies. This might seem like a big thing to throw in towards the end of this review and makes it appear like I've missed a major section of the game, but power-ups really are just a nice shake-up to the gameplay which appear every now and then, much like how they did in the original games. There's a diverse range of power-ups and they create fun standout sections without any major effect on the majority of your playtime. The best use of power-ups is found during chase sequences or gauntlets, where the player gets given super speed and other abilities to make them more maneuverable, offering a fast-paced reflex test that's tense and exciting. However, when it comes to stealth sections which are created due to the invisibility power being available, it doesn't quite measure up to the previous installments at all. Being invisible makes enemies unable to detect you, and they won't shoot at you even if you carry items or bump into them. They'll simply be confused, and there really isn't a challenge here or any timing required like in the previous games. It's a pretty brainless choice between running through the hostile area or just slowly whittling down enemies until they die since they're unable to fight back. Many of you might say, oh, this was similar in Abe's Exodus when you got an invisibility ring and then had to run through an area of enemies. But the difference is that that was a time sequence where you had a specific amount of time to run as fast as you could through a hostile area. In this, you can get the ability, run in, hurt an enemy, run back, and just whittle everything down, and there's no real time limit to getting towards the end. You kind of have all the time in the world that you want, whereas in Abe's Exodus you got one chance, and if you messed up then you died. The combat power-ups for Munch are a nice addition as well, but effectively all this leads to is you just sitting in the same place just electrocuting enemies over and over again until their massive health bars run out, which is an issue with the fact that the combat isn't very interesting. It's just one button and you do damage over and over again. A pretty big problem with the power-ups that I noticed is that they're on very short timers. And this is great if you're playing a chase sequence where you have to get through an area in a hurry or else your super speed will run out and you'll be vulnerable. But when it comes to stealth sections and combat sections which use power-ups, what you'll usually end up doing is stocking up on power-ups, running into the area, doing as much damage as you can, running out of power-ups, returning back to the vending machines, stocking up, and retrying the sequence again and again until all the enemies are cleared. This is how I played every sequence, and although you might think this is just a boring way to play, I would firstly argue that the sequences should have been designed better so they couldn't be broken like this. But if I was going to continue defending my point, I also don't understand how you can play these sequences any different. Let's take a look at this stealth section for instance, which because most of the sequences are pretty repetitive, this is pretty much how every invisibility power-up sequence will go. In this example, Abe is given an invisibility power-up and there are bombs around and sligs in his path. Now I don't see what else the game is telling me other than I should blow up these sligs. But then it sets the timer of the invisibility power-up so short that I'm required to head back to the machine and restock it several times before all the enemies are dead. The developers must have felt that this was an interesting enough problem for the player to solve when it's really just very repetitive and easy, with no danger to the player. There are Madokins to save here and no real incentive for me to run through, so I'm assuming I need to kill everything, but the game has set the timer so I can't kill anything in one power-up boost. These sequences are designed to give the player power-ups to tackle a problem, but only if they have to go back and refill them several times, and this isn't an isolated problem. The developers have designed their puzzles to be brute forced rather than solved, and I would struggle to point to even a handful of sequences which work this way in the original games. Sure, there was some tedious backtracking to get explosives and prayer rings in the previous games, but more often than not you would be using these to tackle barriers and obstacles in different parts of the level, not just the same small area of the level, because it was filled with so many enemies that the player couldn't take them all on in one go. These sequences just feel like they're designed to waste the player's time. But once these big moments are done, you'll eventually always be back to babysitting your combatants, directing them to fight over and over again, looking for combatants, counting combatants, wondering if your combatants are dead or simply stuck on a piece of environment, and if the combat fails, endlessly possessing enemies to thin out the herd. At times, even the big set-piece moments fall on their face from time to time, with the worst culprit being the section where you must herd a group of meeps into their cage to gain the trust of some fellow Madokins. You're expected to round them up using Munch in his wheelchair, but the meep's movement is so unpredictable while herding them, it's more time efficient to simply pick them up using Abe's pick-up ability and chuck them into the pen one after the other just to get through it. It's not only a boring section that has been poorly thought out and unpolished, but it also highlights the general lack of care which is missing this time around compared to the old games. Abe's ability to pick up objects is once again a tactic which sadly works for the meeps and getting through a lot of other problems that can be found in Munch's Oddysee. The old games would never have required players to just push through and ignore the puzzle in front of them just to avoid the tedium of completing it properly. You may have noticed in that last segment that I finally mentioned Munch a bit, having mostly spoken about Abe's involvement in the game. I'd like to say this was completely planned, but when I came to write down my thoughts about the game after having played through it twice, I found that there's very little to say about Munch. Although you can switch between the characters instantly at any point and they have very different playstyles, for a game that's called Munch's Oddysee, you may expect that Munch would be the primary character you'd play, or at the very least Abe and Munch would have equal playtime. In my experience, neither of these were true, and for a majority of the time, Abe is the clear favourite character to play. While Munch can uniquely swim, and every now and again gets to control certain machines like mechs or even a crane to move stuff around, Abe overall has a lot more utility. Abe can order Madokins to work, he moves faster, can jump, can pick things up, possess enemies, and a majority of the fighting sections include Madokins whom Munch can't order around. Munch is extremely slow and hops on his one flipper when moving along the ground, and if he jumps then he simply falls over. In the few levels where Munch can get hold of a wheelchair, then he's much more versatile on land, but this only improves his speed, and his jump allows him to only clear low walls and narrow gaps, making Abe still more useful to explore the level. However, as soon as Munch gets into water, everything changes, and Munch becomes incredibly fast and high jumping. Although I've complained about Abe's stripped-back movement on land, when Munch is in the water, his movement is extremely fluid and fun to control, and is proof that Oddworld inhabitants still have an eye for movement if they're given the time to perfect it. Even with Munch getting an advantage in water, Abe just gives players a lot more options, and since the entire game can't be set in water, a majority of the playtime is spent on the land, with players naturally selecting and playing as Abe a majority of the time. In order to make use of both characters, you might expect that most of the levels would split into branching paths, with only water-accessible areas, or obstacles requiring Munch-controlled machines to clear, but this really isn't the case. A lot of the game is spent exploring with Abe, only taking control of Munch to either move him onto a pressure pad to open a door, take control of a crane for a beef section, or taking a quick swim to reach an area which Abe can't access. Even with Munch's meat herding puzzle, Abe is far more useful, and a lot of the time you'll find yourself controlling Abe and picking Munch up simply because completing a level with Abe and then following his footsteps with Munch is just too time consuming. There are Munch dedicated levels, and these are some of the best, and nearer the end levels start to open up and offer more branching paths for Munch to make use of. But these come very late in the game, and Munch's Oddysee spends a lot of its early to later hours still giving players the same repetitious puzzles of standing on pressure pads to open doors, or directing Mudokons to pull levers, things which simply don't require Munch all that much. Level design and the general look of Oddworld in Munch's Oddysee have also fallen victims to the restricted development time. Unlike the strange and diverse alien world we were presented with in the cinematic platformers, Munch's Oddysee is very lacking in comparison. The game effectively has three environments. You have an industrial environment, natural environment, and then a mixture of the two. Compared to the forest, wastelands, numerous industrial plants, temples, and even nighttime environments we had in the original games, each of Munch's Odyssee's environments come across as extremely bland and repetitive, using the same textures and assets over and over again. This is especially noticeable since the entire game is set up for Munch and Abe to visit numerous industrial plants during their adventure to fund Lulu. Most players would have a hard time remembering the difference between Magog Motors and the Brewery to Be locations in Munch's Oddysee, whereas they would recognise Boneworks or Slig Barracks from a single frame alone. It's a real shame, especially with the knowledge of how much grander the story was going to be, that Oddworld Inhabitants clearly had to restrict the amount of varied locations that they could show, especially since Oddworld was now fully 3D rendered and the environments could just be so much more than just pretty backgrounds. However, development issues have clearly had restrictions on the amount the team could do, and although Munch's Oddysee is more technically impressive than the earlier two games, the striking backgrounds and locales of the earlier installments put this game to shame visually, and make every environment feel extremely similar. Every level in Munch's Oddysee is now blocked off by either high walls or just falls into nothing, with a fog covering up the draw distance. Given how striking the backgrounds were in the earlier titles, it's a shame Munch's Oddysee couldn't replicate this and wasn't given the development time from Microsoft. I don't think this is an entirely unreasonable expectation from a game of this era, since other exclusives at the time, like Jak and Daxter, which was developed on the lower spec technology of the PS2, has great skyboxes in comparison, which made the world feel much more complete, not like every level was taking place on featureless high hills and deep valleys. When it comes to level design, the levels also aren't developed to facilitate the movement of the characters. Obviously, when it comes to Munch, the flat areas of water are perfectly fine for movement, if still way too sparse in how often they turn up. But when it comes to Abe, his play space is extremely restricted from what we saw in the earlier titles. For games which relied so much on verticality and layered levels, Oddworld is now noticeably flatter. Any times platforming or walking along ledges do come into play, they immediately fall into an area of frustration since most platforms' jumps are way too narrow for how quick and floaty Abe controls. Players will frequently fall off narrow platforms, have followers fall off ledges, and also fail to clear gaps as Abe jumps straight up into the air and doesn't have much distance. The design of the levels don't appear to be built with how casually Abe controls in mind, leading to a lot of frustration whenever the player has to do anything with accuracy, a playstyle which Abe is not built for, but the game world is. Unlike the previous games, which are so tightly designed around Abe's awaiting movement, in the 3D space that same care just hasn't been taken, so a game so well known for its movement and platforming simply isn't here anymore. While playing Munch's Oddysee, for the most part I actually did enjoy myself, and that might surprise you given how negative this whole review came across. When looking back on it and writing down my thoughts, I was also surprised by how many problems I had with it. I don't like to think that I'm being too picky, as I've simply laid out my observations about the game and what it was trying to achieve, and how it did fail to achieve it in many areas. I was also struck by how many features had been brought across from the 2D games, and how much had been lost during the transformation into 3D. I always try to edit myself down to the point where I'm being as objective as possible, although I realise that even what I think is objective is still very arguable. But even when exploring the game in this manner, Munch's Oddysee comes across as a mess of a game. Its combat is simple, its platforming is frustrating, it lacks any mechanical depth to provide meaningful challenges to the player, and its dual protagonists aren't used appropriately, making it feel like yet another Abe game with Munch tacked on, instead of his own Oddysee. Finally, the level design is ill-fitted to the character movement and provides very little for Munch to actually do. And of course, I'll just chuck it in one last time that I don't like the style and tone of the game, although I think I've said enough on that to last anyone for a lifetime. However, in its defense, I must say that whilst playing the game, it is easy to be lost in the world of Oddworld, and this is where I can only fall into my subjective experience. Whilst Munch's Oddysee is very flawed and is clearly a rushed game, it isn't like anything I've seen before. With the fresh eyes of the Oddworld Inhabitants team, they craft a unique 3D platformer, which certainly isn't perfect, but it is playable enough to lose yourself in, even with its numerous flaws. The look of the world is equally unique, and even though Munch's Oddysee feels like a poor imitation of the Oddworld we saw in Abe's Oddysee and Exodus, even the poorest imitation of that astounding level of creativity is still more interesting than pretty much any other game world on the market back then, and arguably since. And there are shining moments when everything comes together and you get a glimpse of what Lorne Lanning had in mind. Those moments where you play as Abe leading Munch and all their followers into battle, and the dynamic soundtrack kicks in, becoming more layered and complex as more fighters join your small army. The single-player co-op sections where you switch between Munch and Abe, as Abe possesses enemies from the high ground, whilst Munch swims deeper behind enemy lines. And the rare moments when both Munch and Abe have something to do, and the level design comes together to facilitate their playstyles. However, these sections are still few and far between, and a lot of the game is spent repeating the same basic solutions to the limited problems that the devs have time to come up with. Munch's Oddysee was certainly a missed opportunity, but the team were experienced enough to piece a game out of what they had, where a lesser game studio would have put out an unplayable mess. Lorne Lanning and team put out an interesting mess, and that at the very least deserves credit in light of the struggles they had to face in order to get even to that point. But on a final note, I just want to say thank you very much for watching this long review of Munch's Oddysee. I hope it was worth the wait if you're one of the 38 people who had already subscribed to my channel, but if you're new, of course, I hope it gave you at least some interesting insights into a game which sadly isn't talked about enough. Next time, I'll be continuing my look into the Oddworld series by diving into the little played follow-up called Stranger's Wrath. I hope to see you then, whenever that might be.